The mop water rippled the moment the words cut through the hallway. Some people just don't know their place, the woman said sharply, her voice soft enough to pretend innocence but loud enough to wound. Dreams are for people who actually have a future. The hallway fell silent. Students shuffled aside, glancing nervously between the woman and the man whose name she hadn't bothered to learn. He stood near the end of the corridor, pushing a cleaning cart with one gloved hand. His posture was calm, almost too calm, the kind that comes from years of swallowing disrespect because responding costs more than silence. His name was David, 42 years old, black man, janitor, according to the badge clipped to his shirt, dreamer. According to the truth, he carried quietly beneath it. He didn't look up yet, didn't answer, didn't break. The woman, Mrs. Harrow, the staff liaison, folded her arms. Honestly, I don't know why you bother talking about going back to school. Some people are just meant to stay where they are. Students exchanged looks. A few froze in place. David finally raised his eyes. Gently, not angry, not fragile, just steady. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I wasn't talking about going back to school. I already finished." She laughed, sharp, brittle, like glass cracking in cold air. "Oh, please. What kind of degree do janitors get? A certificate in mopping?" A few students winced. David kept his grip on the cart. His knuckles tightened around a rubber handle for half a second, then relax again, the micro moment only visible to someone who cared to notice. No one did. He simply said, "I'm proud of the work I do." Mrs. Harrow scoffed. "Pride is cheap. Reality isn't." She leaned in, lowering her voice but not her venom. "And reality is, people like you don't make it." What she didn't know was that the truth she dismissed was about to stand in front of her with more dignity than she had ever shown.
Before we continue, if you believe no one deserves to be mocked for their dreams or judged by their job title, subscribe to Black Justice. These stories shine a light on truth, dignity, and the resilience of everyday heroes. Now back to the story.
David didn't answer her. Not yet. Instead, he glanced at the floor tiles he'd been polishing, the ones reflecting her expression back at her, warped by the water but still recognizable. He turned away slowly and pushed his cart toward the end of the hall. The students parted for him, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. It wasn't the first time they'd seen her demean someone. It was the first time they saw her do it so publicly. And it wasn't the last time he would feel the sting. That morning unfolded like a storm in slow motion. At 9:45 a.m., an administrator rushed into the hallway, flustered and breathless. "The superintendent is visiting today," she said. "Everyone needs to be perfect. Clean. Ready." Her eyes landed on David. She frowned. "You," she barked. "Make sure the West Hall sparkles. And for heaven's sake, try not to be seen." He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." He never argued, never resisted, never returned what was given to him, except in work. Quiet work. Work that made floors shine, trash disappear, handrails gleam, bathrooms smell like lemon instead of despair. Invisible work. But invisible did not mean unimportant, only unacknowledged. At 10:12 a.m., while David polished a trophy case, two teachers passed by whispering. "That's him," one murmured. "The janitor who keeps talking about starting a program." "A program?" the other laughed. "For what?" "To help kids apply to college." Both teachers laughed. "Bless his heart," one said. "He's sweet. But let's be real. Who's going to take advice from a janitor?" The other nodded. "Exactly. Kids need role models." Their footsteps faded. Their words didn't. David inhaled, exhaled, polished the glass until their reflections disappeared. At 10:50, Mrs. Harrow returned, heels clicking like judgment across the floor. She spotted him kneeling to fix the loose metal trim near the science wing. "There you are," she said sharply. "I need you in the auditorium." He stood. "Is something wrong?" She sighed, theatrically, as though oxygen were wasted on him. "Everything is wrong. Chairs are crooked. The stage is dusty, and the superintendent will be here in 30 minutes. She walked closer, narrowing her eyes. And don't start telling people about your little dreams again today. No one needs a distraction. David paused. I wasn't. Yes, you were, she snapped. Every time I walk by, you're telling some student they can be better. If you want to fantasize about college, fine, but don't drag others into your delusion. He swallowed. I'm only trying to help. You want to help? She said. Stay in your lane. She walked off without waiting for a response. David stood still for a long moment, staring at the corner of the auditorium sign. Not angry, just tired. Tired in a way that lived behind the eyes, not the muscles. Lunch hour arrived. Students scattered through hallways. Teachers crowded the lounge. The building buzzed with chatter and footsteps, life moving fast in every direction except his. David pushed his cart past the cafeteria when he noticed a girl sitting alone on the floor, knees drawn in, hands shaking. Her backpack was open. College brochures spilled out like fallen feathers. He slowed. You okay? He asked gently. She wiped her eyes quickly. Yes. I mean, no. She gestured at the brochures. I don't think I can do any of this. He set the mop handle aside and crouched down, not too close, not too distant. What makes you think that? She sniffed. People like me don't get into good schools. My grades are fine, but everyone keeps telling me the world's too competitive, that dreams are unrealistic. A faint smile touched David's face. Unrealistic dreams built every real thing you see. She laughed weakly. Says who? He hesitated, then said softly, Says someone who knows. She blinked. You? Really? He nodded once. I had big dreams. Still do. She studied him as if seeing him for the first time. You did? David nodded. Dreams don't disappear. They wait. Before she could answer, a sharp voice shattered the moment. There you are, Mrs. Harrow. Of course. She approached with stiff irritation. I knew it, she hissed. Spreading false hope again. Don't you understand? These students don't need bedtime stories from someone who couldn't even finish college. David straightened. Ma'am. Enough, she snapped. You're embarrassing yourself. The girl stood protectively beside David. He wasn't. Hush! Harrow cut her off. And you, she said, glaring at David, should really stop pretending you're anything more than... She stopped mid-sentence. A voice echoed across the cafeteria. A voice none of them expected. Excuse me, is there a problem here? The building principal, Ms. Caldwell, approached with 3 district officials behind her. Her gaze flicked between them. Not unkind, but observant. Mrs. Harrow froze. Oh, no. No problem at all. Just redirecting him to a task. Ms. Caldwell nodded slowly. David? Everything all right. David opened his mouth, then closed it. I'm fine, he said quietly. Ms. Caldwell studied him, her expression weighing more than her words. Good, she said softly. We'll talk later. She turned and walked away with the officials. Mrs. Harrow released a breath she'd been holding. The girl stared at David. You shouldn't let her talk to you like that. David pushed the cart forward. It's okay. It's not, she insisted. He paused, spoke gently. I've learned something very important over the years. What? That not every battle needs noise. Some just need timing. The girl frowned. What does that mean? You'll see, he said quietly. But even he didn't know how soon the moment would come. At 3:14 p.m., another storm brewed, this time inside the auditorium. Rows of chairs lined the room. Teachers rehearsed their speeches. Student volunteers polished the banister and straightened banners, welcoming the superintendent. David walked quietly along the side aisle with a broom, adjusting chairs as he went. Conversations faded when he passed, not because he was invisible, but because people were unsure what to say. He pretended not to notice. He always did. Halfway through the row, he heard laughter, harsh, dismissive. Mrs. Harrow again. She stood with a group of teachers, whispering loudly enough for him to hear. It's adorable, really. He thinks he could start some mentorship program here. As if anyone would listen to a janitor. One teacher laughed. Another shrugged. A third muttered, harsh but true. Harrow smirked. Some people mistake work ethic for destiny. They're not the same. David set the broom aside, quietly, deliberately, and walked toward her. The teachers fell silent. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I'd never pretend I'm better than anyone. I just believe every student deserves a chance." She rolled her eyes, save the inspirational quotes. Some of us live in the real world. And then she stepped closer, close enough for cruelty, close enough for precision. "You will never be more than what your uniform says you are." Silence. Heavy, thick, shameful silence. But not from him, from everyone else, because the superintendent had walked in behind her and heard everything. The superintendent froze a few steps behind Mrs. Harrow, his expression hardening as her final words hung in the air like smoke. David didn't turn around. He hadn't realized anyone else had entered the auditorium. He simply lowered his eyes, gently picked up the broom, and stepped back. "I'll finish setting up the chairs," he said quietly. But the superintendent had already heard enough. He stepped forward. "Is that how you speak to staff here, Mrs. Harrow?" Mrs. Harrow stiffened, her face drained of color, then flushed with panic. She turned and instantly forced a smile. "Sir, I didn't see you. That was taken out of context." "It wasn't," the superintendent said calmly. "I heard every word." Teachers in the room froze. No one dared breathe. The silence sat heavily between them. David stood still, not proud, not vindicated, just steady, almost too steady. The superintendent turned toward him. "David, right?" David nodded once. "Yes, sir. I've heard good things about you." Mrs. Harrow blinked. "You have?" The superintendent ignored her completely. He continued speaking to David. "I heard you keep this building running, and that you've been supporting students quietly behind the scenes." David shifted slightly. "I do what I can." "He does more than that." A voice chimed in. The girl from earlier, the one with the brochures, had stepped into the back of the auditorium. She held her backpack at her side, gripping the strap with trembling determination. Everyone turned. She swallowed hard. "He helped me today. He talks to students, encourages them, listens. No teacher has ever done that for me the way he did." A murmur spread across the room. The superintendent nodded. "Thank you for speaking up." The girl looked down. David gave her a small, grateful smile. Harrow's voice returned, tight with discomfort. "With all due respect, sir, this is highly inappropriate. He's a janitor." The superintendent raised an eyebrow. "Yes, and, well, there's a place for everyone. A role. We can't have employees overstepping." "Overstepping?" the superintendent repeated quietly. "Yes," Harrow insisted. "He has been distracting students with unrealistic ideas. And this mentorship fantasy? It's unprofessional." David inhaled slowly. This wasn't new, just louder. But the superintendent's next words shifted the air. "Is it really unrealistic," he asked, "for a man with a degree to speak to students about college?" The room froze. Harrow stared. "A degree?" The superintendent nodded. "Yes, I reviewed his file before coming." Harrow shook her head, stunned. That can't be right. He never said he had a degree." The superintendent turned to David. "Would you like to tell her?" David hesitated, not out of fear, out of humility. Then he spoke softly. "I earned a bachelor's in sociology," he said, "and a minor in education. Graduated with honors. But life took some unexpected turns." A few of the teachers exchanged wide-eyed glances. David continued quietly. "I took this job because it was steady work, honest work, and I needed it at the time." Harrow stared at him as though he'd shape-shifted. "You mean to tell me," she whispered, "that all this time you had a degree?" David nodded. "And you chose to stay here?" "I chose to stay employed," he corrected gently. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the truth. The superintendent folded his arms. "Mrs. Harrow, did you ever ask him about his background? Or did you simply assume?" She struggled for words. I didn't know." "He didn't say." The superintendent frowned. "Did you ever give him a chance to?" Silence again. Not the awkward kind. The truthful kind. Mrs. Harrow's mouth opened and closed like someone drowning in her own arrogance. But the moment wasn't over. Not even close. At 3:26 p.m., the superintendent walked toward the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the staff, "I want to share something personal." Everyone turned toward him. David felt the weight of the room shift. "I grew up in a home where respect wasn't tied to a job title," he said softly. "It was tied to the way someone carried themselves. With dignity. With decency." He looked toward David, and with quiet strength. David met his gaze. The superintendent continued. "Schools are not held together by administrators. They're held together by the unseen hands. The custodians, cafeteria staff, aides, the ones who show up before the sun and leave after everyone else." A few teachers lowered their heads, ashamed, and from what I've seen, the superintendent added, one of those unseen hands has been mentoring your students for years unofficially, voluntarily, silently. He looked directly at Harrow. "Instead of mocking him, you should have supported him." Harrow could hardly stand upright now. "This," the superintendent said to the room, "is not just a janitor." He paused. "This is an educator, with a degree, a heart for students, and the potential to contribute far beyond polishing floors." Anything that was going to be revealed later had just taken its first breath. Still, David held his posture, gentle, humble, almost reluctant to accept any praise. But inside him something flickered. Not pride, recognition. He had been seen. Finally, the superintendent wasn't finished. He turned back to David. "You ever consider applying for a student support position?" he asked. "Mentorship counseling? Academic coaching?" David blinked. "I wanted to," he admitted, "but the postings asked for experience and recommendations." "You have both," the superintendent said firmly. Harrow stared in disbelief. "But, sir," she argued weakly, "he has no formal role in counseling." "But he has something far more important," the superintendent interrupted. "Impact." He turned to the girl who'd spoken earlier. "Miss Jasmine," she said quietly. "Jasmine," he said gratefully, "thank you again for speaking up. Your word matters." She nodded nervously, but her shoulders lifted a little, the weight of invisibility shifting. He looked around at the teachers. "If a student speaks more highly of the janitor than any staff member," he said, "we need to ask ourselves why." A ripple of discomfort moved through the auditorium. "False," she faltered. "Well, exaggerated, misleading, and distracting." "And what exactly," he asked slowly, "did he do wrong?" Harrow opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "He's pretending he understands collegiate pathways," she finally blurted. "As if he's qualified." The superintendent exhaled through his nose. "Harrow," he said gently, "you should stop talking." She froze. But he wasn't angry. He was preparing her for something she didn't know was coming. Something big. Meanwhile, on the other side of campus, a student named Ben rushed up to David. A shy boy. Quiet. Always on the edge of things. "Mr. David," he whispered urgently. David set down the dustpan. "What's up, Ben?" I showed my mom the essay topic you gave me yesterday. She said it was the most I've written in months." David smiled softly. "That's great, Ben." The boy nodded. "And I was wondering, could you maybe help me with math too? Maybe after school?" David hesitated. Not because he didn't want to, because he didn't know if he should. "That's something you should probably ask your teacher first," he said carefully. "But if you want help with the basics, I'm happy to sit with you during lunch today." Ben lit up like a lantern. "Really?" David nodded. The boy ran off joyfully. And just like that, before anyone official gave him permission, authority, or a title, David continued doing the work of someone who believed in kids. But the superintendent had already made up his mind. Today the truth would be revealed, in the most poetic way possible. At noon, the PA crackled on. "Will all staff members please report to the auditorium at 12:30 for an urgent announcement?" Teachers looked at each other. Another meeting? Probably budget cuts. Or a new rule. The students buzzed with curiosity. Harrow straightened her blazer, already preparing a speech in her head. And David? He simply wiped down a row of lunch tables, unaware he was a quiet center of everything. When 12:30 arrived, the auditorium filled. Teachers took seats. Counselors lined the sidewalls. Office staff filed in. Jasmine and a few other students were permitted to sit in the first row. Then the superintendent entered. The room fell silent. He stepped to the podium. "Thank you for coming," he began calmly. "Before we proceed, I'd like one particular staff member to join me on stage." People shifted. He looked toward the side door. "David," he said warmly, "would you come up here, please?" David froze, a broom in one hand, a rag in the other, his work apron still tied. The room held its breath. Students whispered, "That's him. Is he getting fired?" "No, he's getting promoted." Harrow straightened, preparing to speak, but the superintendent raised a hand subtly, blocking her attempt before it began. David walked slowly to the stage, setting the broom aside as if it were fragile. He took his place beside the superintendent, and something shifted in the air. A quiet acknowledgement that this moment mattered. A lot. The superintendent spoke clearly. "Most of you know a version of this man," he said. "The one who sweeps your hallways, who clears your spills, who keeps this building functioning." He paused. "But most of you have no idea who he really is." A ripple moved through the crowd. Harrow stiffened. The superintendent continued. "Yesterday, I witnessed conduct in this auditorium that troubled me deeply, not because of what David did, but because of what was done to him." Harrow's eyes widened in panic. She opened her mouth, but the superintendent lifted a hand again. She fell silent. "This morning," he said, "I learned something else, something very few people know." He clicked a remote. The projector behind him flickered on. A still image appeared on the screen. A grainy security camera angle. The early morning hallway. And at the center, David, standing alone, facing a blown generator. Whispers broke out instantly. "What is that? What happened? Is that dangerous?" The superintendent explained. "At 5:17 a.m. today, a major electrical failure occurred in this building. A failure that could have caused flooding, fire, or a complete shutdown." Gasps spread through the room. "And the person who prevented that disaster," he said, turning toward David, "is standing beside me." The room erupted. Shock, respect, guilt, awe, everything at once. David's head lowered slightly, humbled despite the praise. Harrow's mouth fell open. "You're telling me," she stammered, "he fixed an electrical hazard alone?" The superintendent nodded. "Yes, and he did it correctly, safely, and expertly." A teacher asked quietly, "How would he know how to do that?" The superintendent smiled. "I'm glad you asked." He clicked to the next slide. A scanned diploma appeared. Bachelor of Arts in Sociology, minor in Education, certificate in Facility Maintenance, Operations, additional certifications, Electrical Safety, Building Systems, Emergency Preparedness. A collective gasp filled the auditorium. Harrow sat frozen, completely defeated. The superintendent spoke slowly. "This is a man with education, with training, with knowledge, with dedication, and with a heart for students." He turned to David. "You never bragged. You never asked for recognition. You simply worked, quietly, diligently, and when this building needed you most, you stepped up." David swallowed hard. "I just did what needed to be done," he said softly. "He didn't raise his voice," the superintendent said, turning back to crowd. "He raised the truth." The room fell silent, respectful, moved, and then, ironically, Jasmine stood up again. "Sir?" she asked timidly. "Yes, Jasmine." She stepped forward, hands trembling, voice small but unwavering. Can we make him our student mentor? Officially?" The superintendent stared at her, and then he smiled. "That," he said, "is exactly what I was about to propose." The room burst into applause. Not the kind given to a hero, the kind given to someone who finally received what he always deserved. The applause in the auditorium swelled like a wave. Unexpected, overwhelming, and utterly sincere. David stood still, his breath catching in his chest as dozens of students, teachers, and staff honored him with something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition, respect, human dignity. He lowered his eyes, not out of shame, but out of humility that ran deep in him. The kind that only grows in a person who has lived too long in the shadows. The superintendent raised a hand for quiet. Before we move forward, he said, there is something else that must be addressed. The room settled. The atmosphere tightened. Everyone knew exactly where this was heading, except perhaps the one who feared it most. The superintendent turned toward Harrow. His tone was steady, measured, controlled. Yesterday, a staff member, he said, publicly humiliated another employee. She questioned his worth. She mocked his intelligence. And she belittled him in front of students. Harrow stared down at her lap, trembling. The superintendent continued, not only is this unacceptable, it is unethical. And as leaders, we must be held to a higher standard. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Harrow stood abruptly. Sir, please. I can explain. He raised a calm, quiet hand. There is nothing to explain, Margaret. You showed contempt, and you did so loudly. She swallowed, her voice cracking. I didn't know he had a degree. That's the point, the superintendent replied gently but firmly. You didn't know because you never asked, and you never cared. Harrow's throat constricted. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the weight of her actions, the years of subtle cruelty she had justified as professionalism. Sir, she whispered, I was wrong. The superintendent nodded. Yes, you were. Then he added, and there will be consequences. The room froze. Every eye locked onto him. Harrow's knees nearly buckled. The superintendent spoke in a clear, steady voice. As of today, you are suspended for 2 weeks without pay. You will complete mandatory sensitivity, leadership, and equity training. And upon your return, you will issue a written and verbal apology to staff and students, including David. A loud gasp filled the auditorium. Harrow covered her mouth, eyes filling with tears. This isn't fair, she whispered. No, Margaret, the superintendent said softly. What wasn't fair was what you did to him. A hush spread across the room. Harrow sank slowly into her seat, shattered not by cruelty, but by truth, because humiliation hadn't been forced onto her. She had earned it. When the meeting ended, dozens of students rushed toward the stage. Mr. David, you're awesome. You saved the school? I didn't know you were so smart. Can you help me with my college essay, too? He smiled at them all, overwhelmed but grateful, answering each one gently. As the crowd thinned, Jasmine walked up to him, smaller than the others, eyes still nervous, but glowing. Are you really going to be our mentor? She asked quietly. I hope so, he said. She swallowed. You helped me believe I could actually apply for college. David tapped her lightly on the shoulder. Then do it, he said. Go farther than I ever did. She smiled, really smiled, then ran off with her friends. Later that afternoon, the superintendent called David into his office. The room was quiet. Warm afternoon sunlight streamed across the desk. David sat with his hands folded. The superintendent leaned forward. David, he began, I've been reviewing your file since yesterday, and this morning the footage confirmed everything I needed to know. David remained silent, waiting. I want to offer you a position, the superintendent said. David blinked. A new role, he continued. A position focused on mentorship, academic support, and leadership development. A role that uses your degree, your experience, your heart. David exhaled slowly. I don't know what to say. Say yes, the superintendent said with a warm smile. We need someone like you. David hesitated, emotion flooding his chest. What about my current job? He asked. I don't want to leave anyone without support. The superintendent chuckled. That's the kind of integrity that makes this promotion necessary. Then his expression softened. I want you to understand something, he said. You are not being moved out of your janitorial role because it is beneath you. You're being moved because you have outgrown it. David's eyes glistened. You have the potential to change lives, the superintendent said. Not just rooms. David looked down. A single tear hit his knuckle. He nodded. I'll do it, he whispered. The superintendent stood and shook his hand firmly. Welcome to the Student Success and Development Team, Mr. Anderson. Word spread across the school like wildfire. Students cheered. Teachers congratulated him. Even the custodial team celebrated with a clap on the back and jokes about moving to the big leagues. But the real moment, the one no one saw, happened long after school ended, when the hallway lights dimmed, when the last bus rolled away, when the building finally slept. David walked back into the auditorium, the scene of his humiliation and the scene of his rise. The chairs were still arranged neatly, the stage still quiet, the air still filled with echoes of that morning. He looked around slowly, absorbing everything, every moment of being underestimated, every quiet act of kindness, every insult he swallowed, every child he guided, every hour he worked unseen. All of it had led here. He stepped onto the stage and sat slowly on its edge. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to feel proud, not because others finally saw him, because he had always been worthy. Long before they noticed, he reached into his bag and pulled out his diploma. The paper had worn edges. The frame was cheap, the ink slightly faded. But to him, it was gold, and for the first time, he didn't hide it. He placed it on the stage beside him, staring at it, honoring himself. A single thought rose in his chest. Dreams don't die. They wait for the world to catch up. David stayed on that stage until the building fell silent. He stared at his diploma, not as proof of worth, but as a reminder. People are never just what they seem. Everyone carries a story, a struggle, a history no one sees. And sometimes the quietest people fight the hardest battles. Humility isn't weakness. Kindness isn't ignorance. Silence isn't emptiness. And respect? Respect is the only thing that costs nothing but means everything.
If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of humility, subscribe for more emotional justice stories. Share this message. Help someone remember their worth. This is Black Justice, where every story reveals the truth behind the judgment.